In this lecture, we're carrying on from our last lecture, where we were discussing later Lutheranism and the evolution of the Lutheran Reformation in Germany. And in that lecture, the previous lecture to this one, we discussed more of the political and social ramifications as to where Luther and the Lutheran Reformation went. And those are vital and important to understand Luther, if not to understand Lutheranism over the centuries. In this lecture, we're going to look more at the theological issues and the controversies and the swirling issues that give shape to Luther's understanding of both the gospel and of pastoral ministry in the church. And it's important to note that in the case of Luther, often what we have are inappropriate or underdeveloped slogans about what Luther believed. Having taught for years on Luther, I always marvel at how students believe they understand Luther, and then when they ever hear lectures on some of his ideas, or at times when they read through his works, they often come away going, boy, that's not what I expected him to say at times. And I think this speaks to a more popular understanding of Luther that needs more development, frankly, if we're going to understand the man. I find, at least in the modern world, there are a lot of slogans and simplistic articulations of Luther, for example, on law and gospel and grace, that actually are things Luther himself never said. In some cases, there are things that Luther flat out rejects. And so in this lecture, we're going to be looking at a couple of issues as they develop and swirl around, particularly in the 1520s and into the 1530s, as to what Luther actually taught and believed on the doctrines, in this case, of predestination and of the law. First and foremost, with the doctrine of predestination, one of the things we noted when we talked about Calvin and Calvinism is the fact that too often the doctrine of, quote, predestination is seen as somehow synonymous with Calvinism or the Reformed faith. Most of that identification, though, comes from the 20th century. Those who have championed the doctrines of predestination, let's say, or of God's sovereignty in the modern world have often been doing so against either Wesleyan Arminianism or a more revivalistic evangelicalism, which tends to default to free will views on the Christian life. And so those who have fought more vociferously for the doctrines of, say, predestination, etc., often self-identify as Calvinistic or Reformed, and therefore the modern sense of this is that it's Calvin who really is the first to say this. Now, just right out of the gate, as a historian, I have to point out that Augustine himself and numerous people throughout the Middle Ages discuss, affirm, in different ways for sure, but they all affirm some understanding of this doctrine of predestination. In some ways, in fact, to call yourself Augustinian is not all that different on the doctrine of predestination than to call yourself Reformed or Protestant or something like this. Well, with Luther, we get conflicting data at times. The first issue with Luther and with the development of Lutheranism is that Luther seems to affirm and deny the doctrine of predestination at the same moment. Anyone who comes across Lutherans of a variety of different stripes will often, if you say that they believe in predestination, be met with resistance to this idea. Lutherans today, by and large, again, there are varieties that are different, but a lot of Lutherans are very uncomfortable with the doctrine of predestination. And yet, there are places in Luther where he is very clear about his affirmation of the doctrine of predestination. Well, first, let's get our categories correct here. When we're talking about the doctrine of predestination in terms of theology, we're not talking about the question, first and foremost, as to whether or not God is in control of all events that happen on this earth, good or evil. That question is the question of sovereignty, and that's not what we're discussing here. Predestination, biblically and in terms of systematics, is, to put it really simply, probably overly simply, is the question of who moves first in the context of salvation. Did God move first, taking out a heart of stone and putting in a heart of flesh? Did he give you eyes to see and ears to hear? Or did you invite him or reach out or give assent in some way, which then led him to come into your life? I mean, there are all kinds of shadings and varieties of this, but to put it at its most fundamental core issue, it's the question of who moves first. And in the Reformed, Calvinistic, Augustinian, whatever word you want to use, tradition, there is an affirmation that we desire things There's always a belief that our will is intact. It didn't get eradicated. We're not robots. But as I often like to say, our wanter is broken. The very things we want, the things we desire, are not the things of God, left to our own sinful devices. Our heart is skewed. If you see it as a scale, our scale is broken. Think of a scale in the old market sense where you'd put a weight on one side and some produce on the other to determine the weight of that produce. Well, if that's the will, we have a broken scale. You can't balance and weigh the things of God on our own, apart from grace, in any type of legitimate way. We still want what we want, but what we want is sin. We have a heart of stone. So when we're talking about predestination here, we're talking about who moves first, who reaches out to whom first, and from that, what flows out of the Christian life. Well, the complexity of this in Lutheranism over the years, in some ways, comes directly from Luther himself. The first instance of Luther's treatment of this comes in 1525, when he gets into a slog match, a real fight, with Erasmus. Now, Erasmus had been the prince of the humanists. He had been the man who had given the Greek Bible and all kinds of countless and invaluable things to the church. It's sometimes said, a bit overstated, in fact, very overstated, that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. Well, it's overstated because, as we'll see here, the two actually fight and disagree on the gospel itself. Erasmus always maintains that good works and all these kinds of things are possible and necessary for the Christian life. He remains Catholic to the day that he dies. Well, what happens is Erasmus, because he, even in the context of the 16th century, was being accused of opening the door for Protestantism. Erasmus, in the early 1520s, sits down and he writes a treatise more or less against Luther's understanding of the gospel. And his argument there is that we have the freedom of the will. Our wanter isn't broken, Erasmus says. We can weigh the things of God on our own. We don't need grace first and foremost to come into us. That we have a natural capacity within us to do good, and therefore we need to, you might say, exercise those muscles and try to affect that in our life. This, in some ways, is, again, a bit of a caricature, but this is more or less the medieval system. Works are on our backs, and we ought to perform them. Well, in 1525, Luther came out with one of the biggest barbaric yelps, you might say, against the medieval understanding of the will and of its role in the Christian life. And the book is entitled, fittingly, The Bondage of the Will. Now, in this book, again, we're looking at a complex of different ideas. It's not only the doctrine of predestination, rather, it's the context of why the doctrine of predestination is important in and of itself for just about every Protestant in the entirety of the 16th century. In fact, up until the rise of Arminianism, there really is no Protestant who doesn't, in many ways, affirm what Luther says here in The Bondage of the Will. What Luther says in long form is what I've just said, which is that our will on its own, because of sin, because of original sin, is in bondage. Now again, notice, no one ever says that the will is gone, that it's broken, that we are mere robots. No one is a fatalist in the Reformation. Rather, the idea here is one of being in bondage. Lacking freedom of the will is not lacking the will itself. Nor does the lack of freedom of the will mean, Luther says repeatedly, that we simply don't want things that we are made to want, either good or evil. Rather, the bondage here is more in terms of the ultimate choice to follow God and embrace the gospel or not. And Luther doubles down. He says very boldly, our will is in bondage. It cannot save itself. It cannot weigh the things of God and choose Him apart from the work of Christ in us first. The biblical motifs here are, again, the heart of stone is taken out, the heart of flesh put in. Ears are given to even hear the gospel first, eyes to see. Without that, what we call regeneration in modern systematics, without that regeneration, which is a motif of resurrection, the dead man is resurrected. Well, to put it simply, dead men don't make choices. And so without that renovation, without that coming of the grace of God to save us first, to move first on us, then we are in bondage. And what Luther is undercutting here, again, is the entirety of the medieval system, which Erasmus, in his own unique idiosyncratic way, is reasserting. In some ways, there is no alternative for Protestants, at least in this first generation, but to say that we don't choose God. For all of them, Luther, Calvin, Cranmer, others, to say that we move first or that we had some natural capacity, they feel is the back door, you might say, to reasserting this idea of good works in the Christian life. And so, in 1525, Luther issues this real, you might say hardcore, real serious, stodgy defense of the bondage of the will. And notice, this is years before Calvin's even become a Protestant, so to argue that Calvin was the first to talk about the freedom or the lack of freedom or the bondage of the will is anachronistic. Still, though, why do Lutherans, as the years wear on, become uncomfortable with the doctrine of predestination? Well, the short answer is Luther does later in his life, in his lectures on Genesis, come pretty hard against anything that smacks of fatalism. What happens is Luther hears, not of Reformed people, but of people in Germany, Lutherans, who get a hold of the doctrine of predestination, and they say, he quotes, that because they are predestined, that any belief in the gospel, any resting on the gospel, any life in the church and the sacraments and these things is irrelevant, that it is not the determining factor of the Christian life. And he says that these people are alleging that if you're predestined, you're in, no matter what. If you're not predestined, it doesn't matter. If you're reaching for the church and participating in the sacraments, all of that has now become irrelevant. This is, you might say, the classic frozen chosen type folks. And notice, Luther's attacking other Lutherans who have kind of landed in this frozen chosen motif. It's not Calvinism that is the initial frozen chosen problem, people. Well, Luther, in his commentary on Genesis, again, slaps down hard on this, and he says, give me a break. This idea that predestination is somehow divorced from the Christian life itself is not the doctrine of the Bible. He argues that instead, predestination is something you only really recognize after you see faith. Luther, you see, will always encourage people to take part in the sacraments, to really almost be full effort towards embracing the gospel and resting apart from works of the law, getting away from this idea of penance and merit, but working hard to embrace the law-gospel dichotomy. It's not a work in and of itself, but it's a sort of inverse of that, a ceasing of attempting to make God happy. But it does require some, you might say, effort. It requires some real motivation to embrace the gospel. You can't be passive about it. And so when he hears things of those who are believing, again, what you might call the frozen chosen, this idea that predestination is all that matters and we can somehow figure this out in our own life, or even worse, that you don't know and you just kind of wait around to see when you die if you're in or you're out. Luther comes down hard on this. And that latter move, the coming down against those who are really sort of hyper-predestinarian, forms the context of the ongoing development of Lutheran theology. Later on, when you get to the Formula of Concord, which is something like the Westminster Confession or the Wesleyan Quadrilateral or some of these really important confessional documents for the denominations, the Formula of Concord in the 1570s is that document for Lutheranism. Well, in it, they write, there in their confession, that predestination or eternal election of God extends only over the godly, beloved children of God being a cause of their salvation. Now notice, they do affirm predestination, but all they're saying here, all Lutherans want to say, is that when you see grace in your life, when you see that first grasping for the gospel, and as the Christian life wears on, as you're continuing to grasp it, predestination is the backstop, you might say, that stops people from thinking, boy, I better go on about my own works, or my faith is kind of weak, I better work on it. These kinds of, again, more medieval penance merit systems of understanding the Christian life. Lutherans will always realize and affirm that you don't have to be Catholic to believe in merit or good works as the grounds of your life. It's a natural default human position. It's a problem we all have. We all succumb to the problem of attempting to make God happy by our effort and our merit. And so what Lutherans believe is, stop that. When you see the gospel at work in your life, know that it's God at work, not you at work to make God come down. And so it's a buttress, you might say, against the idea of good works as the grounds of the Christian life, as merit, as being something you have to have or else you're going to be thrown out. The other thing that Luther talks about is how predestination is to be preached. Luther is very, very bold to say, don't preach this. This is not something you talk about. You can't ask the question, am I predestined or not? There is no righteous or biblical grounds, Luther says, to ever ask that question. And I think a modern example of this comes from Spurgeon. Spurgeon really does, frankly, embody some of what Luther is intending here. There's this famous illustration or analogy, you might say, that Spurgeon uses, where on the front of the gates to heaven, he says, there is, come all ye who are weary and laid on your burden. Come one, come all. God so loved the world, this kind of a thing. And then as you go into the gates, you turn around and you look up behind the gates, and it says, predestined from before the foundation of the world. In other words, for Luther, predestination is something that is an ex post facto. It's something that's realized after the fact. It's not something you ever talk about in the context of the Christian life. Now, in the Reformed tradition, in Calvinism, you might say, that allergy to talking about it is not there. So they will talk about it in the context of the Christian life. They'll talk about predestination. They won't dwell on it overly long, but they're not averse to talking about it. In Luther and Lutheranism, they are. So as the development of Lutheranism carries on, again, you see some changes, some tweaks, and some developments. What about the law? What about grace? Well, if there's any sloganized and misunderstood subject of Luther, I think it's this one, frankly. I have read far too many blogs and seen far too many pastors who run around doing, here I stand, and I have come to set the captives free, and all this language of, frankly, again, the slogans of what they think Luther taught. And they talk excessively of grace, and they don't realize that Luther, believe it or not, is not with them on this. What do I mean? Well, the problem with Luther, in understanding his theology at least, is that he doesn't give us a ready-made single volume where he says, okay, here's my gospel. People sometimes point out that he's not systematic in the way that he writes or the way he argues his points. And that's actually telling if you think about it. For the man who is so synonymous with the doctrines of grace and the gospel, for him not to write any single volume on it per se, particularly not in the context of the 95 Theses and so on, is simply telling. It's actually one of the great struggles to ever study Luther is to try to triangulate between what he's saying, what we think he's supposed to say, and what we come to a conclusion on here. Well, in the context of the gospel, it's often said that what Luther cared about was grace. He wanted unmerited salvation. Christ's work has paid it all. The problem is Luther never says it that way, and he actually kicks a man out of Wittenberg for saying something exactly like this. The controversy here is called the antinomian controversy, and it is surrounding a man by the name of Agricola. Agricola was a man who, from time to time, was a professor in Wittenberg, a teacher at least. He went back to Eisleben, which was a place where Luther himself had studied. And what happens is Agricola gets really kind of hacked off, his nose put out of joint, by what he thinks is a misapplication of Luther's gospel. What happens is in the 1530s, Agricola more or less goes after Melanchthon, not necessarily by name, but certainly in concept. Melanchthon in the 1530s had ordered a survey or a examination of all the pastors in Lutheran areas. And he had sent people around to examine not only their theology and their preaching, but their life and their upstanding role in the church. And Agricola, frankly, loses his mind here. He seems to be scared that certain pastors will be maybe removed if they're found to not be moral, upstanding citizens of godly living. And he starts to say things like, well, this isn't the gospel. The gospel is grace. We can't bring any law to bear on Christians. How dare you examine them? We're all sinners. We all fall. We all stumble. Bringing the law on people like this when they're Christians is a blasphemy, Agricola says. Well, famously, 1540, he flees. He is pushed out of Wittenberg. And a lot of what pushes him out is in 1539, Luther wrote a book called Against the Antinomians. This book is important because it actually gives us the slogan or the word antinomian, which we still use today. Antinomian, the word nomos in Greek, means law, So an antinomian is someone who's anti-law. Now notice, 1539, Luther is writing a book against those who are against the law. Not the kind of free grace, kind of easy, light burden guy that you expect Luther to be. Well, what's going on here? Well, a couple of things. What Agricola has essentially done with the gospel is he has equated, we might say in the 21st century, the sinner's prayer with justification. Meaning the one moment when you walk that aisle, when you bend the knee, and you submit to Christ, Agricola says, all right, you're justified. Now you no longer live under law. Any talk of obedience, of Christian living, of good works, any of this stuff is therefore entirely opposed to the gospel. It's, big on grace, low on accountability, let's say. Well, Luther finds this crazy. Why? Well, the reason is Luther never preaches just grace, just the gospel. The motif for Luther, and for most Protestants, is law, then gospel, as a recurring need throughout the Christian life. In other words, what Agricola has done is he suspended the reality that all throughout the Christian life is you need to be reminded of the responsibility of obedience in the law and the standard that you're supposed to live up to. If you go to a Lutheran sermon, if you go hear Luther preach, he's going to actually blast law for, let's say, roughly half the sermon. He's going to hold up the standard. This is what a Christian ought to live like. You ought to be this. You ought to do this. You ought to not do this. These are the things that you are supposed to live up to. Then, however, in a traditional Lutheran sermon, you transition to gospel. Once people have felt that sting of judgment, the next step is, it's okay. Christ has paid it all. There is only one who has actually lived up to this. And that move is repeated every Sunday, every sermon, every opportunity. It's not that the law was that one moment where we felt guilty and prayed the sinner's prayer. It's an ongoing reality of the Christian life. To only preach gospel, Luther says, is to not preach the gospel because you have not held up the mirror of the law to say, this is where you're failing. Now, Luther believes that in the end, there is actual sanctification, you might say spontaneously in the Christian life. That because they feel guilty, they want to do these things, they can't, but when they hear the free grace of the gospel that they are fallen and covered, that then the freedom spontaneously encourages them to maybe, again, spontaneously, as later Lutheran confessions say, do good works as if they had no condemnation or judgment at all. So where Agricola has gone, and I fear at times this is where modern interpreters of Luther have gone with it, is down a direction that Luther does not want to take it. He does not believe that law gospel was one move and now we just live in grace. Nothing but grace is, Luther might say, nothing at all. And so, somewhat strangely, somewhat ironically, frankly, Luther is not on board with so many throughout the years and centuries who have claimed his name for the sake of a kind of simplistic understanding of the gospel. And so, I have actually had students over the years who have found Lutheran friends and attended Lutheran churches. They come in contact and try to experience modern Lutheran churches. And they go, and I get comments like, boy, they were really talking about the law a whole lot. Where's all this gospel stuff? And again, this is what Luther is all about. It is law every time, then gospel every time. When Luther is going on about works of the law or not preaching the law, he doesn't mean that you don't preach the law first and then follow it up with the gospel. Luther's concern is after the gospel, people who then add on, now you must do this as well because you've heard the gospel. Luther is concerned, you might say, with the law condemning, then you preach the gospel, and then you add the law at the end with these obligations of good Christian living as the required demands of the gospel. Rather, he says, preach the law, really actually preach it, show them their sin, point out all the flaws of everybody, including the pastor, and then say, but there is only one who is righteous, and he has died for us. So it's actually a great deal of effort, and there are plenty of times in Luther and in later Lutheranism where works of the law are being talked about. Good works, things that ought to be done. But the pastoral, you might say, homiletics move here is to always make sure that it's law as the condemnation and then gospel thereafter. Two other things to note in terms of later Lutheranism, just so that we're aware of some trajectories. First and foremost is that Melanchthon, Luther's right-hand man, eventually becomes, again, a persona non grata in Lutheranism. What happens is by the end of his life, and certainly just prior to Luther's death, Melanchthon actually shifts some of his positions. Melanchthon, in terms of his sacramentology, begins to actually teach things that are more, you might say, Calvinistic or Butzerian, meaning Martin Butzer, the discipler of Calvin. They're not Zwinglian, but they are not physical eating. That is a big difference between Melanchthon and Luther. More importantly, though, is Melanchthon, by the end of his career, adopts something that we today call synergism. Now, these jargon words need to be explained. There's monergism on the one side and there's synergism on the other. These words are bandied about a bit too often today without explanation. What's in play here is more that issue of predestination and merit. Monergism, as the prefix seems to suggest, is that grace and salvation is one directional, you might say. It comes from God to us. Synergism, again, as the prefix indicates, is this idea that there ought to be some response bias in order for the grace of the gospel to be effective. What's in play here is that Melanchthon isn't so much saying that good works and believing the gospel will have some effect. He does believe that. Luther believes that. Rather, Melanchthon treads towards the position that these things are required, that you have to really stress the change in the Christian life, the renovation of the heart, or else, maybe, there is no gospel in that person. This is, again, classically called synergism. And frankly, and Lutheranism has rejected Melanchthon for this, it sounds, frankly, a good bit like the medieval idea of penance and merit. And so as the years wear on, there actually becomes an immediate divide after Luther's death between a group that become known as the Philippists, meaning those who follow Philip Melanchthon's changes and adaptations of the Lutheran message. And then there's another group called the Gnasio-Lutherans. Now, these weren't clear dividing lines and boundaries. It's not like these are opposing forces in a war, and they're all clear-cut. This is a tussling, you might say, for the soul of where Lutheranism is going to go. Are they going to be, you might say, resolved to stand on every word Luther says, or at least the core of his convictions, including sacramentology and the use of the law and monergism? Or will they allow some changes to come in, either through Melanchthon or others? Well, in the end, when you get to the Lutheran confessions, there in the 1570s in particular with the Formula of Concord, they really double down on being Gnasio, you might say. And Gnasio just means true. It means those who are committed to Luther himself, not to any changes or adaptations later. For this reason, Melanchthon, again, the man who was the right-hand man there, who wrote so much for the Lutheran gospel and the message all throughout those years, is, at least in the collective memory of Lutheranism today, often considered to be a bit of a traitor. Lastly, and not in a minor sense tacked on here, but something we really have to deal with, one of the more troubling, if not the most troubling thing about Luther is his anti-Semitism. We mentioned in a previous lecture about Luther's involvement or the use of Luther during the Second World War. And it actually predates this. The anti-Semitism that occurred in Germany in the modern world was at least propped up in part, not fully, but in part, on the things Luther said. People have tried to wiggle out of this, people who love Luther. There is, I'm afraid, no wiggling out of this. Luther is anti-Semitic. It's something that creeps into his theology later, but it is there in full force. Early in his life, Luther had not expressed anti-Semitic views. In fact, he'd written a book that he thought was charitable to Jewish people, entitled Jesus Was a Jew. And frankly, this is some ham-handed way of doing apologetics with Jewish people, and he thinks that the Protestant message is going to bring the Jews over in droves. And they don't. Later, though, as the years wear on, he hears rumors, frankly, of Jewish converts, meaning people converting from Christianity to Judaism, and of other, what he thinks are unseemly things. And at this point, Luther comes out blasting in the 1540s with his infamous On the Jews and Their Lies. Again, you cannot wiggle out of this. Luther calls not only for the cessation of any Jewish practice, meaning no synagogue, no meeting at all of the Jewish people. He calls for their scriptures to be burned. He calls for synagogues to be burned, and he calls for, at times, executions for those who are belligerent. It is full-throated anti-Semitism, frankly. And it's not just this one book. For years, Luther is quick to raise the anti-Semitic flag, and he does so all the way to the end of his life. In fact, unfortunately, the very last sermon that Luther ever preached, just before his death, was an anti-Semitic tirade against the Jewish peoples, calling for, in this case, their expulsion entirely from Germany. One of the things that we have to wrestle with is that men like Luther are incredibly frail and flawed, and though he is the man who stood up for the gospel, in the end, he was a man of pretty pungent anti-Semitic views. And ignoring it won't help, because there are always people who come across these teachings, and they can be seductive, or they can be the kinds of things that are used as props to say that the Lutheran message was always tainted. I don't think we have to go that far, particularly not with the idea that Protestantism is tainted because of Luther and his anti-Semitism. But still, this hurts. The idea that Luther would spend so much energy and time, not only that he would hold these views, actually, but that he would spend so much time expressing them and calling for real serious oppression of a people, is something that is, frankly, unseemly. So in the end, when we look at the trajectories of Lutheranism, they belie easy categorization. They're not simple. Even the message of the gospel, which we assume that we know correctly, is itself, when we drill down into it, a different thing for Luther and for later Lutherans.